This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the 2024 Warlock. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. We're down to the last two classes of the 2024 Player's Handbook, Warlock and Monk, and I decided to end with these two because my feelings about them are the most extreme of any of the 12 classes. I want to ultimately end our class reviews on a high note with my enthusiasm about the redesigned Monk, so first we'll drudge through some of my unpopular opinions regarding Warlock. In short, my actual play experience with the 2014 Warlock echoes the community's feedback about the new Ranger, a boring base gameplay loop that doesn't feel narratively satisfying. Unfortunately, not enough has changed in the 2024 redesign to make me confident about recommending the class without a series of qualifiers, which to me is a problem unto itself. To revisit my thoughts on the Ranger for a second, the 2014 Player's Handbook base class was largely panned because its distinct features were so situational that they rarely saw play, meaning that the story moments these features promised ended up rarely, if ever, coming up in actual play, leading to much disappointment from Ranger players. The 2024 Ranger redesign, while fixing this problem, presents a new one by focusing too much on Hunter's Mark, effectively discouraging alternative options, while most other classes enjoy an increase in build paths. This Hunter's Mark problem of focusing too much on one gameplay aspect is how I felt about the 2014 Warlock. 9 out of 10 times, a Warlock player would learn that Eldritch Blast was their best choice, regardless of the situation, because doing anything else felt discouraging. Unlike other spellcasters, Warlocks have a unique feature that facilitates their spellcasting, Pact Magic, which much of the community finds interesting because it's different. Unlike the usual spellcasting feature, Pact Magic offers much fewer spell slots, 2 for most of the Warlock's leveling progression, which also happens to be the level range that's most commonly played by far. However, those spell slots recharge on short rests rather than long rests, meaning a Warlock can theoretically use them more often. This presents its own problem, though. Because these 2 spell slots are always at the highest level, if a Warlock has access to a spell that doesn't scale, like Protection from Evil and Good or Darkness, then a higher level Warlock feels like they're wasting their high level spell slot. Not to mention the fact that using their spell to create that effect costs their entire action. An action they could be using to cast Eldritch Blast and deal satisfying damage. More often than not, when I'd get a new player piloting a Warlock, they'd often want to save their spell slots for special occasions. But then, when they would use them, they'd be disappointed by the results. Thus, they'd learn the lesson to just always Eldritch Blast. Yes, I know that from an optimization standpoint, this lesson is untrue. Pact Magic is balanced to the Warlock kit, and Warlocks have other tools like invocations and subclass features that I haven't talked about yet. However, in my experience, for new or casual players excited to play a spellcaster, Warlock ends up being disappointing more often than not. And the same players that pilot other spellcasters, like wizards and clerics, that have a wider range of spell slots don't feel this way. Now, every time I bring up casual players, a common response I hear is, but what if a player just wants to fulfill a narrative with their character? What if they're fine with whatever the mechanics are, and they just want to play a character that's made a pact? This is also where the Warlock's design really bothers me, and continues to bother me in 2024. Why is Eldritch Blast the Warlock spell? Why is it that only characters that make a specific pact with any other worldly entity get this cantrip? But if they worship the same entity, instead they end up with cleric spells. Even in Baldur's Gate 3, early on in the game, the party Warlock, Will Ravengard, mentions, hey, you know how I can Eldritch Blast? That's how you know I'm a Warlock. But why? The definition of the word Eldritch is weird, sinister, or ghostly. I'd understand it if Warlocks only made deals with fiends and great old ones. I think even Fae are pushing it. But what about Celestials? Why would making a pact with a unicorn or an angel grant a character a sinister or ghostly spell, much less something outright devilish like Armor of Agathis, or otherworldly and alien like Hunger of Hadar? Asmodeus is even called out by name as a fiend one can make a pact with. And yet, if you're a trickery domain cleric and you choose Asmodeus as your deity, instead you end up with Sacred Flame and Guiding Bolt. Now, this is what I'd do if I was allowed to redesign this class, and it also involves redesigning the Sorcerer. If it were up to me, I would take Eldritch Blast and Pact Magic and move them over to Sorcerer. The Sorcerer story is of a character born with innate magical power that they learn to control. I'd represent that with Pact Magic. And of course, I'll call it Pact Magic for now, but it would be called something more appropriate like Sorceress Magic or Origin Magic or something like that. The idea being that, again, like Warlock is now, you get limited spell slots that are always at their highest level and recharge on short rests. While bards, clerics, druids, and wizards train to hone their magical talents, sorcerers have less regulation. They always cast their spells at their highest level. However, Eldritch Blast, which would get renamed something like Sorceress Blast or something, is a manifestation of pure magic, the unfiltered essence of the weave that's unlocked by their sorceress origin, whether that origin is draconic, aberrant, clockwork, or wild. However, in addition to meta magic, these sorcerers would also be able to use their sorcery points to create lower level spell slots, addressing the problem of lower level spells on the sorcerer list that don't scale. Now, as sorcerers level up, not only do their spell slots get bigger and recharge more often because they're innately magical, they get better and better at regulating their power, represented by their sorcery point progression. And hey, wouldn't it be nice if the sorcerer's current innate sorcery, which is basically a magic rage feature, worked with Eldritch Blast? It'd be like a one-time power-up moment per long rest where the sorcerer unleashes all of their magic to get advantage on each individual Eldritch Blast beam. It would also just finally really separate sorcerer from wizard. The two classes would feel very, very different from each other. But then what would Warlock look like? Personally, I loved the Arcane Halfcaster template that was used in the first 1D&D playtest version. These Warlocks can still lean into more spellcasting or weapon using based on their invocation build, but it rounds out the universal spell lists by giving each one a halfcaster to choose. As halfcasters, it puts Warlocks one step below Wizards, representing the fact that they quote-unquote cheated to get their magic rather than mastering it through rigorous study. Although as they serve their patron, they can unlock unusual abilities through their invocations. As for their spells, I'd probably fold the class-specific spells like Hellish Rebuke and Armor of Agathis into the arcane spell list, since wizards already get other named spells like Tasha's Hideous Laughter and Everard's Black Tentacles. It's not like wizards don't get creepy spells already. In summary, my biggest disappointments about Warlock are about the things that haven't changed. Eldritch Blast still scales with total character level, rather than being tied to your Warlock investment. And Pact Magic still feels too restrictive for what you get. So what has changed for the 2024 Warlock? First and foremost, Eldritch Invocations have been redesigned so that you get one at first level and two more at second, a much faster progression than 2014. In 2014, several invocations were just one-time use spells. Those spells have now just been added to the Warlock spell list. Invocations that used to specifically enhance Eldritch Blast can now be applied to other cantrips, although, looking at them, I think they're still best used by Eldritch Blast, reinforcing the issue with Eldritch Blast I mentioned earlier. The level 3 Pact boons, Pact of the Blade, Pact of the Chain, and Pact of the Tome, which used to be exclusive one-time choices, are now invocations that can be taken at any time. You can choose as many or as few of them as you'd like. Pact of the Blade in particular has had the most significant improvements, now being used as a bonus action rather than an action, inheriting the Charisma weapon attacks property from the old Hexblade subclass, and now being able to substitute the weapon's normal damage for Necrotic, Psychic, or Radiant. In addition, Thirsting Blade now unlocks a third weapon attack at Warlock 12, making Warlock a really interesting candidate for Gish builds. As I mentioned previously, I recently playtested a 7th level character that was Valor Bard 6 Warlock 1, specifically to test out these improvements from Pact of the Blade. Although the character may not compete in terms of single target damage with dedicated marshals, it was fun to pivot between being a charisma-based swashbuckler and support caster. Magical Cunning is a new feature at 2nd that allows a warlock to spend a minute rather than a short rest to regain their spent spell slots. This feature can only be used once per long rest and attempts to remedy the issue of players saving their Pact Magic slots by offering a speedy way to get them back. While the apparent scarcity of spell slots certainly factors into a player's decision to use them, or problematically not use them, I found that most Warlock players didn't use their spells because they'd provide a more disappointing effect than just Eldritch Blasting. Curiously, in my home game, I have a single-classed Warlock player that I told to just use the normal spell slot progression. While they still Eldritch Blast most of the time, they are much more willing to try other spells, so that scarcity issue is definitely part of the problem, not necessarily how fast they recharge. At level 9, Warlocks now get Contact Patron, which lets them cast the Contact Other Plane spell to speak with their patron. Given that many D&D games end around level 10, I think this feature is gained a little late. I know it's convenient to design a feature that references a spell that's already built into the game, and giving access to it too early may be unbalanced, but from my experience, new Warlock players want to keep in touch with their patrons as early as possible. So if it's going to be codified into the game's rules, it'd be nice if this ability was gained at level 3 once a player chooses their patron, even if it means somehow decreasing the feature's power. And finally, Warlocks aren't stuck with their Mystic Arcanums anymore. They can switch them out when they gain a Warlock level, as they could do in Tasha's. So, is Warlock the right class for you? Like with Ranger, it's all going to come down to expectations. If you go into Warlock, imagining a full spellcaster, like a Bard, Wizard, or Sorcerer, Pact Magic is most likely going to be disappointing. The vast majority of Warlock players I've DM'd for pick the class because of the storytelling layers added by the otherworldly patron. And yet, the patron's actual involvement in the story is dependent on the DM. Don't get me wrong, some of the best D&D stories I've experienced at the table and read online come about from a player's interaction with a DM-controlled patron. But it also means that if the DM isn't on the ball, the experience suffers as a result. If instead you come to the Warlock interested in the new Pact of the Blade mechanics, or looking to tinker with Eldritch invocations, the Warlock kit provides a sense of novelty. I just think that when compared to other 2024 classes, like Fighter, Rogue, and Monk, it feels like it hasn't shaken many of the flaws of its previous incarnation. As for role, I think it's safest to think of Warlocks primarily as damage dealers with access to neat tricks. Your go-to options are likely to be Eldritch Blast or Pact of the Blade attacks, depending on your build. Even its other unique spells, like Armor of Agathis or Arms of Hadar, deal damage in addition to other effects. In terms of complexity, the player's handbook lists Warlock as a high complexity class. I think that's its design intention, and if you're a mechanically minded player that knows all of the little levers to pull and all the dials to turn, then yes, this is a highly complex kit that can give you a decent amount of power. That being said, based on my actual at-the-table experience with most players, Warlock actually in play ends up being on the low side of complexity. Whereas Ranger may be boring because of Hunter's Mark, at least it has some other tools that it uses that still make it feel in the average complexity. But again, 9 out of 10 Warlock players I've seen build characters spend their action to Eldritch Blast and sometimes use their bonus action maybe to cast a spell or use a subclass feature. With all of that being said, I think the strongest element of the new Warlock design is the redesigned subclasses. Like previous episodes, I'm going to rank the 4 in the player's handbook from simplest to most complex, starting with the Fiend. Now, even in 2014, Fiend was one of the stronger Warlock subclasses. Like all Warlock subclasses, it offers an additional spell list of always prepared spells, like Cleric Domains, offering Burning Hands, Command, Scorching Ray, and Suggestion when you first pick it at 3rd level. Now, while Scorching Ray is redundant with Eldritch Blast on the table, and Burning Hands is likely obsolete by 3rd level, Command and Suggestion are solid spells no matter what level you're playing at. Fiend's 3rd level feature, Dark One's Blessing, is mostly the same, offering temporary hit points when you reduce an enemy to 0 hit points. However, it has a slight buff in that you can also gain these temporary hit points when an ally does the same to an enemy within 10 feet of you. Dark One's own luck is similar to its 2014 version, but now it can be used up to a charisma modifier number of times per long rest rather than once per short or long rest. The biggest change is a nerf to its 14th level feature, Hurl Through Hell, which used to automatically succeed in 2014. Now, it requires the target to fail a charisma saving throw and has had a damage decrease from 10d10 down to 8d10 psychic damage. Still, it's a good feature, even though it isn't as powerful as it once was. With features that help support its survivability and solid spells like Suggestion, Fireball, and Wall of Fire, Fiend Warlock is a simple and effective choice that embodies what most people think of when they think of Warlock as a class. In terms of complexity, next I'd rank Celestial just above Fiend. In some ways, I found players more comfortable with Celestial Warlock if they want to try out healing rather than Druid or Cleric, as Warlock's Eldritch Blast is a reliable damage-dealing cantrip they can do in the same turn as the Celestial Warlock's signature feature, Healing Light. Rather than relying on spell slots, Celestial Warlocks have a pool of d6s, similar to superiority dice, but equal to 1 plus their Warlock level. As a bonus action, they can heal themselves or an ally within 60 feet, expending a number of d6s up to their charisma modifier. The dice pool resets every long rest. New players that gravitate towards healers sometimes aren't satisfied with Bard, Cleric, or Druid cantrips when they can use their action to Healing Word, whereas Eldritch Blast gives the feeling that a player is getting the best of both worlds. The complication comes in paying attention to both roles. Fiend Warlocks just have to focus on Eldritch Blasting, whereas Celestial Warlocks have an additional job. In addition, many new players will spend too many Healing Light dice at once, rather than regulating how they spend them. While this hasn't been a problem often, the ideal time to use a healing spell in a D&D game is different than a video game RPG. Of course, Celestial Warlocks also have a great added spell list, with standouts being Aid, Lesser Restoration, Revivify, and Greater Restoration. Now, it took me a little while to figure out where I wanted to rank these last two subclasses, and like some previous episodes, I can see some arguments leaning one way or another. From my experience teaching new players, I think I'll give second to most complex to the Great Old One, also known as the Gulag. Great Old One has some spells that if I were to be forced to play a single class Warlock, I could see myself using Pact Magic slots on. Dissonant Whispers, Clairvoyance, Summon Aberration. Psychic Spells is a neat feature that allows you to hide your enchantment or illusion spells and change a spell's damage type to Psychic. Awakened Mind can create great role-playing moments, especially in a political intrigue game. At 6th level, Clairvoyant Combatant is a great upgrade to Awakened Mind, which I think pairs nicely with a Pact of the Blade build, and Eldritch Hex is a great benefit toward the limited number of spells you can use with Pact Magic. It has tools that are usable in different game styles, but are simple enough for most players to understand. Which of course leaves the most complicated Warlock subclass, and my favorite, as Archfey. The reason I rank Archfey as most complex has to do with its core features revolving around Misty Step. Right at 3rd, you can cast Misty Step without a spell slot up to a charisma modifier number of times per long rest. This also means you can use your action to cast a spell that costs a spell slot, as per the new 1 spell slot a turn spellcasting rule. It's the only Warlock subclass that asks a player to understand outside rules that come up a little less often in order to maximize the class's effectiveness. Not to mention the fact that optimal positioning is something that takes a little practice. The Archfey spells, which are also effective, also don't have the same direct oomph as other subclasses. Fairy Fire is a great spell, but an example of a spell that doesn't scale with spell slot level. Calm Emotions is great for social interaction, but isn't as simple as something like Awakened Mind. Beguiling Defenses is a neat reaction, but requires good timing to use most effectively. Again, I could see an argument for switching Gulock and Archfey as the most complex subclass, but my gut at the moment is telling me that Archfey just takes a little bit more mechanical know-how than Great Old One. Which brings us to multiclassing. I've talked extensively in past episodes how 2 levels of Warlock is a great dip to add to Bards, Sorcerers, or Paladins as the base class. But assuming we use Warlock as the base class, how do these other classes work dipping in? Now, one of the most interesting elements about the Warlock redesign is, at Warlock 12, getting our 3rd attack with Thirsting Blade. I can see a build where you dip a level or 2 or 3 into Paladin to get a more diverse spell selection and access to Divine Smite. Interestingly, Eldritch Smite, which has been ported from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, has been reworded so that it requires the use of a Pact Magic slot, but it doesn't cost a bonus action like Divine Smite. So you could Divine Smite and Eldritch Smite off the same attack. This multiclass is even used for the artwork that shows what multiclassing is supposed to be. Just as kind of a hint that there's probably some good synergy here. With Warlock 12 as our base class, I could also see picking up 6 levels of College of Dance Bard. Again, giving us more spell slots, but also unarmored defense, and as an agile strike using Bardic Inspiration as a bonus action. One of my main criticisms of College of Dance is that even though it's an unarmed focused subclass, it doesn't get the extra attack feature, which actually means it's easier to invest into it if we combine it with a Blade Lock. And lastly, we have adding on levels of Sorcerer. Again, this is mainly for a more diverse spell slot pool, but Quicken Spell is a great way to add a bonus action leveled spell on the same turn as making 3 weapon attacks. While I feel that Warlock as a spellcaster is still disappointing, I have to admit that as the base of a hybrid martial caster character, the 3rd attack at Warlock 12 with Thirsting Blade certainly opens up some interesting possibilities. Warlock and Ranger are both classes that I'm relatively disappointed in. That's not to say that I think they're unplayable or that it's impossible to have fun with them. It's just that when we compare them to some of the more major changes we get from other classes I'm really excited about, they haven't changed as much as I would have liked them to. I think, though, that if you go in with the right expectations, you can certainly use them to create stories you'll look back on fondly. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, and the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.